Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melie, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome back to another episode of Diamonds in Dumpster Fires. Today we have a very special guest with us. Today we have Nathan Westwick, who is an author, a licensed minister, and a coffee entrepreneur. He is here today to talk about what do you do when life doesn't go as planned. Pretty light topic, right? So if you're a listener of this show, I know you'll be able to relate today. And Nathan, I just want to welcome you. I'm so glad to have you here on the show today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And honestly, with your intro, when life doesn't go as planned, I think we could just say it doesn't, and then we could end the podcast and we're good.
Yeah, so thank you, everyone. This has been another episode.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Micro podcast today.
There you go. It's a new venue altogether.
Yep. Well, okay, I want to mention, first of all, as I said, he is an author. His book is Clearing the Path, Connecting with God in a Cluttered World, and I have read it. It is a great book. Highly recommend. We will have it in the show notes for you to check out. But Nathan, I want to start out with a question from your book. All of us grow up with this dream of what we want our life to look like, and as we've mentioned, life doesn't always follow that plan. And I know in your book you talked about God had this new role for you, but you had to wait 7 years in order to transition into that. What is something that you wish you could go back and tell yourself at the beginning of that 7-year waiting season now?
Wow, I love that. So I would joke with my friends during that season, quoting Tom Petty, the waiting is the hardest part. And, it's difficult to be in a spot where you sense God has something wonderful for you on a horizon, but you don't know exactly how far that horizon is, how long that horizon is going to take to get there. And so that's a challenging space to be in. And I would imagine every single listener out there can relate to that. And if you can't, you will. Just give it time. And so, for me, if I were to go back to like the earlier stages of that, I would probably advise myself to really dig in prayerfully. In Psalm 40, David prays like, how long, God? How much longer am I going to be here doing this thing, when there's a new horizon coming, and, how long is this going to take? Those are heartfelt, honest prayers. And I prayed that a lot during that season. But I think another awareness that we would all benefit from, that I certainly could have benefited from, would just have been, God, what are you currently doing in me that I need to be aware of? So we could call it personal growth. I tend to live in the future as a person. I think there's a lot of strength in that. There's a lot of benefits in that. But one of the downfalls of living constantly in the future is you miss out on the present moments.
Right.
And so if I could go back and counsel myself back then, I would just kind of earnestly say, spend more time focusing on where God is in the present rather than what he's going to be up to in the future. And
Love
just
that.
wait, and he'll get you there eventually.
Yeah, and waiting is so hard. I am 4 years post-divorce and really thought I would meet someone and, move on in that way. I know a lot of listeners are also in that divorced waiting sort of stage. It's uncomfortable being in that in-between. And I love what you said, focus on where God is now. How do we discern that? It sort of feels almost like you're in a waiting room, and yet this is our life. Like we need to live it now.
Yeah, I think, I've heard the term liminal space. It's kind of that space in between. We're not where we were, but we're not where we're going to be.
Yeah.
And so we can look at that on a micro level, like you talked about a waiting room, right? So there's the waiting room of seeing the surgeon, or there's the waiting room of walking down the aisle again, or there's the waiting room of whatever, fill in the blank your particular heart's desire might be. But if we zoom out a little bit, I think we could see life itself as nothing but liminal space, right? Like,
true.
If our original design is to be with God, then based on our current human circumstances and situations, we're in some form of liminal space. So eventually we'll get there. And so it's almost like if we can learn how to stay in the moment and stay present, we will find, and I've actually been practicing this I just am literally, this is day 40 for me of a 40-day fast of sorts. I won't go into all of the sort of details, but it's really interesting because I'm noticing, 40 days ago, I was very future focused and very antsy and very like, come on, God, when is this going to happen? And what are you going to do about this or that? And now I'm so much more at peace. And so even just in that, through that practice of removing something from my life for a season, I've just found my heart is so much more at rest, and I'm so much more content with the present circumstances, and so less focused on the future, even while still being future minded and still being a strategist and still planning on and charting a course, but less anxious about the results and just more comfortable with the process. For those who are in that space, I would just say find pragmatic ways to enjoy, or at least find contentment in the present moment. The future will take care of itself. I think back, my youngest son and I like to golf a lot. And I think back many years ago to our local course here. There's a stretch of holes on the back nine, holes, 15, 16, and 17 that are like my three favorite holes on the course. And I remember teeing off on 15, so excited that 16 and 17 were coming. And I felt like in that moment, God was like, hey, Nate, slow down, buddy. Like this also is one of your favorite holes on the course. Like, what if you just enjoyed this one too, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being so like, otherwise you miss it. And, for those of us that are future minded out there, there's, three types of people, right? The ones who are maybe probably more like two types of people, those who dwell in the past and those who live in the future. Right. In both cases, if you're beating yourself up over what should have, would have, could have happened, or if you're so focused on what will happen or what may happen, both types of people miss out on the moment. And I think we would all agree that finding satisfaction in the present moment is really the key to unlocking all kinds of joys and peace. And this is why, for me, if I'm scrolling on social media, it actually drives me crazy. I have a family, we're a family of five, and there will be times we'll be watching a show or a game on TV, and there will be a commercial break, and I'll look and there's four people with their phones out, and I'm not one of them. I used to be. But like, even in that discomfort of like, okay, well, the main event isn't on right now, so let's just numb out with scrolling. What if instead we all collectively embraced the collective boredom, and that turned into a conversation or a joke or a story from our day or things like that? Like, I found that the more I'm present to the moment, even in the discomfort of whatever the present moment might be, and no matter how long or how short that present moment might be, I've noticed as I've practiced this, just a greater sense of peace and contentment. And that's been so refreshing for my soul.
I love that. And like you said, there really are two types of people, right? There's those who live in the past, those who live in the future. And yet, here we are in the present. I know there are some gurus of mindfulness out there who can very much be in the present, but that seems to be a struggle for most people that I talk to, is just how do you get to a place where you are focused more on what's happening today than either yesterday or tomorrow? Do you have any tips for how to get into that a little bit more?
I would think that most mindfulness folks, experts would, and at least this has been true for me, like, when I allow myself to slow down internally, and the way that I do that is, for example, I used to do a ton of cycling. So I'd be on bike rides, but when I would be on bike rides, I would not put on headphones and listen to a podcast. Instead, I would listen to the sound of my pedals turning over. It was very cyclical, very rhythmic, very soothing. And as I would do that, I would notice birds, and I would notice, like, one time I was riding my bike, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was a creek right here. I've been driving this road, all my life, and never once knew there was running water. It was only because I had disconnected from the stimuli, from the noise, that I was able to notice a creek. And I was like, wow, that's actually really nice, Yeah. So, sometimes for me, it's, like, anytime I go for a walk around the neighborhood, there's never headphones. I'm just listening. I'm just paying attention. I'm trying to slow down my breath, my spirit. If you're in a place where there's inclement weather, I'm here in Southern California, so in the summertime, it's about to get just super nasty. Yeah. It's a matter of, like, even being attentive to, like, I feel really hot and uncomfortable right now. It's actually part of being in the present, is acknowledging that and actually just noticing it. This is silly, but I make a pour over coffee every single morning. And part of my routine, I'm stumbling downstairs, I'm half awake, half asleep. I'm fairly comatose. And when I first put that hot water over the bloom of coffee, like every single morning, I stoop down and smell it because that's part of my ritual. It's part of my, like, let me just slow down and just enjoy this aroma.
There is nothing silly about enjoying the smell of coffee. That is like the
No,
best.
it's actually one of life's wonderful pleasures. And so I would say just in general, because I'm a fast paced guy, I'm driven. I like to, move the ball down the field, so to speak. So as a discipline, I have to force myself to slow down. Sometimes that means I'm driving to work with nothing on in my car.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not driving naked. I'm nothing on musically in my car. That would be super awkward as I'm waving at strangers passing by. Yeah, so like I'm not listening to music. I'm not listening to a podcast. Or sometimes that means I'm going to not listen to podcasts for a season and I'm going to instead just listen to music and just enjoy listening to the art that other people have created. And just like sometimes I sing along, and you know what I mean? It's really about being disciplined, and I'm using that word intentionally, disciplined to slow our minds down and to actually like engage with the tactile world. So depending on your personality type, you're going to do that in different ways, but just like really engaging the senses, engaging, being attentive to your body, being attentive to what's around you. And I want to delineate, like, we're not worshiping these things. I believe that every good thing is a gift from the Creator. So we're not worshiping the things, but in being attentive to the things, we're putting our heart in a posture of worship to the Creator. And then our hearts are more aligned and we actually feel a sense of peace and a sense of enjoyment, or at least acknowledgement of the moment. And that goes for the bad things too. Like, I hate being bored.
Yeah.
And I've actually really, again, as a discipline, practiced embracing boredom. So again, back to the commercial break on a ball game, like, I'm bored. Okay. I'm bored and I'm still okay. I don't need to go, fill that minute and a half gap. Like, I'm actually going to be just fine. And so, but even that is a learning to cope with the present moment, if you will. And so then as I have other, maybe larger discomforts, traffic or whatever, bad news at work or whatever, then I'm practicing the discipline of telling myself I'm okay, irrespective of my circumstances. Right. So,
right.
And there's a fine line we have to delineate between accepting those things, and then on the unhealthy side, we become numb to them, and then that's bad.
Right.
So we want to avoid that.
Right. I want to tie this back to your book here. I know that in the book, you talk a lot about how the ideas of clutter and busyness really can disconnect us. Why do you think that most people do feel tempted to fill their lives with noise, especially in those seasons of waiting or hurting?
I think there's two really, really big facets to that. The cultural waters that we're swimming in are at a torrid pace.
Yeah.
And so, we don't even have to try to get swept up into busyness, clutter, noise. In fact, we actually have to try exceptionally hard to fight against that current and to swim against that stream. So one, we all come by it honestly. Like, human nature is one that wants to stay busy and that struggles kind of sitting still. And this is why our current cultural moment is so fast paced. It's the byproduct of our own humanity and our own desire to fill the empty space. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just what it is. A lot of that is just trained. I turned 50 this past year. And so I remember when smartphones were not a thing. I remember when, you had to go to the record store and buy a CD or a cassette tape. I remember the delayed gratification, and I look at my kids and, everything they want is at their fingertips. And again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing per se, but it's very different. So without beleaguering that fact, because I'm sure we could talk all day about that, but, the cultural waters we're swimming in are moving at an incredibly fast pace. And I would argue an inhuman pace. And so we have to fight against that. So that's number one. We come by it honestly. It's just where we're at. Number two, it sure does make a nice distraction from the pain.
Right.
So, humanity over its entire existence has struggled with pain. I think if you really like pain, there's words for that too, and you need to, seek help. But like,
yes, please.
So it's normal. Yeah. And I would say that emptiness is actually healthy. I'm reading a book right now by Larry Crabb called Shattered Dreams, which, if you're in a season right now of waiting, of disappointment, of, just that longing that like things aren't quite right with my life or with this world, this book is amazing. But what Dr. Crabb argues is that longing actually points to our heart's deepest desire, which is for God.
Interesting.
And so as we sit in that discomfort, and this is why like my natural tendency is to numb out on the discomfort. So as I've learned to embrace boredom, or as I've learned to embrace the discomfort that life presents, because life isn't perfect, it actually is revealing more and more of my heart's desire for God. And I firmly believe that when we can come to grips with that, like if we're honest with the pain that we're experiencing and we allow that pain to point us to our heart's desire for God, God will eventually meet us there. It doesn't mean he's going to meet us there like with the wave of a magic wand,
Right.
but eventually he'll satisfy that. And then that's when our hearts are just like, right? Like, and then God's plan actually comes to pass and comes to fruition because we're no longer fighting against it.
Right. What do you think, though, for the person who maybe does more of the numbing out rather than filling their lives with noise? I hear this a lot with people that DM me on Instagram. I don't think God really cares about me because I've been waiting so long and this hasn't
Mm-hmm.
happened. And maybe he just, cares about other people more. Maybe he's just not going to do a work in my life. And obviously, there are times where we do have to admit that, maybe our desires, God isn't going to fill those. What kind of encouragement would you give to the person who's just sort of like, this isn't working, I'm just going to be meh about it?
Yeah. I mean, just my knee-jerk reaction is don't lose heart.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to do. Like you wouldn't arrive to that space unless but I can relate. Like I had, a 7-year waiting period. And honestly, that 7-year waiting period was very spiritually difficult for me. And at the end of that 7 years, I was in a spot where it really felt like God had abandoned me and my family. We had made a decision that we felt God led us into, and I'm actually certain even today that God led us into it. But the ensuing 7 years were just nothing but pain and hardship. And it's like, man, God, why would you do that? Right? That just doesn't feel fair. It doesn't seem right. It certainly wasn't what I was hoping for or expecting. And at the end of that 7 years, I legitimately was like, God, where, during the whole 7 years, I was like, God, where are you? But after 7 years of that, you kind of grow tired of the question. And you're like, I guess I've just been discarded. I've been kicked to the curb. God may have favor for other people, but not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really hard, like in my mind, I can comprehend God is displeased with me because of this thing or these things that I've done. Therefore, I deserve this. That's easier to comprehend than I've been obedient, and yet I still feel like God is distant. Like that's rough.
Yeah.
And I will say that to the person out there who's listening, who's like in that spot where it's just like, man, I'm doing the right things. I'm seeking after God, and yet he still seems distant. Press into that, because Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount, like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of God is theirs. And the poor in spirit means that we're so destitute that we realize that we can't do life without God. And there's that grasping and that hunger and that thirst. And eventually God will show up. So my story, I had followed God obediently, and it involved serving him with a church plant. And, this was supposed to be like God and me partnering together to change the world. And it was going to be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It was 7 years of really hard times. At the end of that, I had decided, like, I'm done with church. God and I are fine, but I'm done with church. And we had actually gone back to our home church was our home church, but it was like 7 years, 8 years, 10 years prior. I forget chronology. So we were a part of the church, highly invested. And then like we weren't, because we did this other thing, and then we were coming back. And I had made the decision. It was the last worship song, and I was going to turn to my wife and tell her right there on the spot. And she looked like she was enjoying herself. And so I was like, well, I'll just wait till we get to the parking lot. And I had come to the end of my rope, and we never made it to the parking lot before God swooped in and rescued me. And I tell you, and it happened with a conversation in the lobby that I wasn't expecting. And that moment turned my corner. And had God not intervened in that moment, I don't know that I'd still be married. I probably would have ended up having an affair and getting a divorce and all the things. Life was hard, and it was hard because I felt abandoned by God. And there's a beauty in that on this side of it. When you're experiencing it, it just sucks like nothing else. But there's a beauty on this side of it where you see that it only could have been God's hand that protected me and saved me and my marriage. I mean, we've been married almost 26 years now. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. It's been quite a bit of work, but it's the most worthwhile,
Yeah.
But like God, he rescued me. And I don't have a God story unless I experience despair. I was joking with some friends. We were playing golf last weekend, and we were playing poorly. And I kept joking, like, well, you can't have a good comeback story if you're not woefully behind. But like, that actually, the comeback stories are the things that our hearts resonate with. We're like, yeah, like like, remember the movie Rudy with the kid from Notre Dame? Like,
Yeah.
we're just like, yeah, go, you got this, buddy, you got this, right?
Yeah.
Those stories can't exist if we're already on the all-star team. And we don't have God glorifying stories in our life if we can do it all on our own. And I think about, there's a song by, I love the band Switchfoot. Their lyrics are so good. There's a lyric in one of John Foreman's songs that says, "The day that I lost myself is the day that I found God." And I just love that. But in order for us to truly lose ourselves, it oftentimes takes those moments that just feel like we're just dragged through the mud. And so if you're in that season, man, just read the Psalms. Like, David is emotional and he's raw. Like, Psalm 40 is one of my favorites because it became my prayer for years. God, how long? Like, in that Psalm, it says, "You lifted me out of the mire." But it's like, sometimes we have to be stuck in the mire for a while. And also, I'd like to think my book would be helpful, and also check out Larry Crabb's Shattered Dreams. Like, it's hitting me even right now. I'm reading it really slowly because it's just so good.
Wow.
So anybody going through hardship, man, I'm actually planning on leading my small group through that book, because whether you're going through hardship or, you're counseling people who are, like, it will just lend all kinds of insight. And the truth is, all of us have lives that turn out not quite like we had hoped. Right. And that's just part of living.
Yeah, our lives change all the time. We change careers. Our family doesn't necessarily look like what we had in our mind. So we're all in these places of change. But what do you say to the person who is like, you know what, I think that God is absolutely saying no and shutting the door on this dream, and I don't have another dream? What does that person do?
So I actually genuinely believe this to be true, even though when I'm personally experiencing it, I struggle to actually genuinely believe that it's true. On a macro level, I genuinely believe this. So here's the intellectual statement. God's dreams for us are bigger and better than our dreams for us. I genuinely believe that to be true. And it's so easy to counsel somebody else with that advice. And when you're in the middle of it, it's so hard to actually believe that it's true. Right. What I found helps is, and this has been both from innumerable personal experiences, but one of my biggest challenges in life is to surrender. And I think it's probably humanity's biggest challenge, but it's certainly mine. So to surrender the dream, to surrender the vision, to surrender the ambition, the hopes, even surrendering the fears, right? Like, with the hope of starting anew with, say, a new relationship or a new family or whatever. It's also coupled with the fear of being alone, right? So so we surrender those things. We literally, like, one of the practices that I do is I'll imagine placing these things at the feet of Jesus, like physically placing them. And that's so stinking hard to do. And a prayer that I've just recently added to that prayer of surrender is, okay, Jesus, what do I have to receive from you? Like, what do you want to offer me as I surrender? It's the sense of, we tend to hold so tightly to our dreams and ambitions, and that's okay. Like, we have these dreams and ambitions because there's something in our hearts that say there's more available. It's just that our pursuit of the more can tend to take so many different sideways turns. Right. And so we can't surrender with clenched fists. We have to open them up, right? So we have to live life open-handed.
Right.
And so then, like, I'm sitting here as I'm talking to you, I just opened my hands for a visual, and then, like, we have to turn them over and release those things with genuine authenticity. And then we got to turn them back up, facing upward, and say, okay, God, like, what do you have for me? And my personal experience is the answer to that question takes time. And so I have to practice a daily surrendering of these things in order to receive what God has for me. And that's hard. But that practice is a driver of intimacy with God, because I'm now once again poor in spirit and dependent on God. Right. Every single time that and literally, like, one of my practices, I read about this in my book, but I go upstairs before bed, I go into the closet, and I get on the floor, and I'm literally on my knees with my palms up and arms out. And it's like, okay, God, I'm surrendering all the things. And my new prayer that I've added to that is, and may I receive what you have for me.
Love
It's
that.
just it goes back to being in the moment. Because if the discontentment of the present moment points us to this heart's desire for more, and if that heart desire for more actually reveals a deep longing for God, then where are our hearts going to be most at peace? They're going to be most at peace in the presence of God, because that's what they're designed for.
Right.
How do we find that presence? We have to surrender and let go of all the things that we put in the way. And so there's this like paradoxical relationship. And then as we do that, then we feel safe. And God, I genuinely believe, and I've experienced it, God unfolds plans that we never would have guessed. And even Paul writes this at the end of Ephesians 3, may God accomplish infinitely more than we could ever ask or imagine. That's mind-boggling. But if we, to get to that spot, we actually have to like let go. Like, okay, God, like, because I can imagine a lot. I've got a great imagination. And so, all right, let's let go and just see what you got, God. And I would say all of us, we're way better looking back, if we're intentional about it, looking back to see how God has met us in our places of pain or in our places of celebration. It's way easier to look back than it is to see forward. And so a lot of that for me is just, remembering God's goodness, even through sharing stories like I did with you about not making it to the parking lot before God intervened. Like, that reminds me that Jeremiah 29:11 verse of like, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Like, a lot of times it feels like he has, or sometimes it feels like he has, but the truth is he hasn't. It's just so critical to believe that we have to believe God's plans for us are bigger than our plans for us. And it reminds me of like, when my kids were little, and we hear stories like this. I don't want to beat that one too much, but like, the stories. And if you're around kids, you see it. Like they think they want the candy bar, they think they want the local carnival, but you actually have plans to take them to Disneyland, and they just don't know yet. Like all the stuff, right? Like, it's cliche, but it's cliche because it's kind of true. And so to actually come to that acceptance, and again, if you're in that spot and you're listening, just read Psalm 40 and read it like a lot, because that will become the cry of your heart. Because David is in that spot. He's like, I want to sing this new song. There's this new song you've placed on my heart. There's more stories to share, but God, I'm stuck right now. Like, how much longer are we here?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that how much longer, I think, I know I personally relate to really well, because a lot of times it feels like in this waiting, my life is on hold. And I know I hear this from listeners a lot. It's like, okay, I believe that God has some plan for me. Intellectually, we know it is better than what we could plan for ourselves. But when we have this single vision for something specific, I'll just use the example because a lot of divorced people are in this boat of like, I'm divorced and I want to get remarried. And so anything outside of that almost feels like a consolation prize. I know for myself, this is going to sound super probably spiritually immature, but for a long time, people would say just, you have to accept what is and be in the moment with God. And I was like, well, what if I end up happy like by myself? Then God's never going to bring somebody because he'll be like, oh, she's fine.
That's funny. I love the honesty on that. That's so good. And what I was going to say, like, people are so quick to offer really great, pithy advice when they're not experiencing it themselves.
Right.
And, like, I remember when I was 20, my best friend died unexpectedly due to heart failure. And well-meaning Christians would put their arms on my shoulder and be like, well, Nathan, God doesn't give us anything more than we can handle. And good things come to those who love him. And I'm just I'm going to punch you in the face. Like, I'm freaking grieving right now.
That's awful.
And so I get it.
Yeah.
What I would say is, and this is part of the premise of my book, is, when you look at encounters in scripture with people who encounter Jesus in the flesh, when they're with Jesus, their lives are transformed. They're not wanting anything. They just want him.
Right.
And so I think a lot of times God strips down all of our personal ambitions, hopes, dreams, etc., so that we can arrive at a spot where we're like, you know what, God, if I just get you, like, you were talking one of the questions a minute ago, like, what about when you're feeling God is distant? Like, all right, God, like, I'm at the end of my rope, man. If I can just have you, that'll be enough. And it's because when we arrive to that spot, we're actually stepping into the presence of the infinite God. And our lives are so focused on the finite, it's hard to comprehend infinity. I used to be a high school math teacher, and I would, do this little mind game about, is there different sizes of infinity, right? Like, because our brains don't comprehend. And the truth is there are,
Oh.
and I won't get into that too much, but if you don't believe me, just think about like all the positive numbers. That's like an infinite set. But then if you put the positive and the negative numbers, that's twice as big, but there's still infinity, right? So like this concept of infinity is it stretches our brain. But the point in all that is like we can so easily settle for, because it's what's in front of us. We settle for the finite at the expense of, and this is that Larry Crabb book. We often settle for the good at the expense of the great. So we settle, in my words, we settle for the finite at the expense of the infinite. And so those who walked with Jesus didn't want or need anything. They had it all because they knew that they were with Jesus.
Right.
And so, you go to that fundamental idea, doesn't mean that God's not going to bless you with a happy marriage at some point. It also doesn't mean that he's not, like right. it goes back to that surrender of like, okay, God, like if I just have you, that's actually what my heart is after anyways. That's what all of our hearts are after. And so, in my book, I kind of lay out a roadmap based on scripture, based on Isaiah 40, not Psalm 40, but Isaiah 40, of how we can walk with Jesus and have all of that transformation happen. And, in the book, there's an afterword that's just flat out raw, because like, here's all this great promise, but also there's also real life, right? Like, so anybody listening is like, yeah, like that all sounds great, but you don't know my life. Like, well, I don't, but we all have stuff. And so like, in the afterword of my book, like don't cheat and read that ahead of time, but like in the afterword, it's like, yeah, there's all these things that are available and good. And yet, right? Like, and yet a tax bill comes, and yet I get in a fight with my wife, and yet, the car is a flat tire. Like this is just reality. And right. So sometimes, and I tend to idealize life. And, if there's any Enneagram fans out there, like I'm high 7 on the Enneagram. I run from discomfort, hate it, all the things. Yeah. And so, but that discomfort is also part of life. And I'm trying to not run from the discomfort, but rather embrace it, because that's just, there's scriptural reference, like Jesus's disciples were hungry. And so they started picking the wheat on Sabbath and they got in trouble. Like, if you're with Jesus, shouldn't I never be hungry? Shouldn't I be full and smiling and singing Kumbaya all the time? Like, well, not Kumbaya, because it's already there, but but they're hungry. And they're so hungry that they're picking wheat. So it doesn't mean that life is always rosy.
Right. And I think that is a misconception that a lot of people have, and it's easy to get there because we think this promise of, if I have Jesus, we do have everything we need. But in our, finite minds here on earth, a lot of us will think, oh, everything I need means everything I want. Well, no, it's everything you need. And so there is that difference in that.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And I think about like, I run a small business and we do a lot of wholesale coffee supply. So when COVID hit, 70% of our revenue disappeared overnight because we're supplying cafes that are all shut down. And I didn't know how we were going to make it. And, and I could talk for hours about how God intervened in that. But, 2 stories come to mind. Like I had my kids get their food handlers licenses. They went in to work at the shop. And when they were young, they used to work at the shop in bag coffee or whatever, sweep up and earn money for Christmas presents. So my kids were like, oh, cool, we get to earn money. I'm like, no, we get to eat. And even then I wasn't sure where the money was going to come from. And then we had people just like donating food. One of my friends was the manager of a restaurant, and he had a ton of like loaves of bread and some frozen seafood. And he's like, I can't use it. Do you guys want it? Like literal fish and loaves.
Wow.
Right? Like
love it.
And so, are we thrilled having the same loaf of bread for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks straight? Like, okay, well, variety's nice, but our needs were met, so yeah. So it's and oftentimes I think that what we need is we're not even aware of what we actually need.
Right. Yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. There are times where, I feel like, oh, I just need to go. Like I need to get more and more done. And then that's inevitably the time I'll get sick and have to rest, because what I really needed was rest, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about, we've been talking through all these things, that don't go to plan, lives that, maybe are looking different than people imagined. What would you say is one of the biggest surprises that God has shown you in those times in your life?
I want to say God had a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for me. Like that's the story we all want to hear. But I can't say that with integrity. But what I can say is, as I look back, even in those really hard church planting years and that that felt kind of a destitute season of waiting, like as I look back, I see that God actually was with me, even though I didn't feel him close. Let me tell it through this. So the name of my company is called Wild Goose Coffee Roasters. I always get asked, why Wild Goose? So my answer is, in Celtic tradition, when Celtic farmers would go hunting wild geese, the pursuit of the wild goose would lead them on these crazy, unpredictable adventures. And they'd come around and sit at the campfire at night and share of their hunting exploits as this, this grand escapade, and how it was just, far exceeded their dreams and imaginations. And so it became a term of endearment for God. Chasing after the wild goose will lead you on crazy, unpredictable adventures, and those that will exceed your wildest dreams. So that's why I named my company that, because I wanted to pay tribute to that. And what I tell people is nothing has ever gone according to script. But as I look back, everything is way better than I would have written myself. When we hear that, the tendency is to think, oh, he found the pot of gold. Like, the pot of gold is at the rainbow. Like, all of the things he wanted, he got. No. Well, like, all the timing, all the things worked out. Like, no, it actually means the opposite of that. It means that all of the things that I wanted, most of them I didn't get. All the timing on the things I wanted, most of them it didn't work out. But when I look back, I go, oh, that's actually, it's turned out better. And so that requires a daily surrender. It requires a daily communion with God. And I don't get it great every single day, but at least on a heart posture, like, that's what I want, because I know that in God are the riches of life. And so I'm daily learning to trust that his plan for me is better than mine, and to admit that I don't actually know the definition of better in that context, but God does.
Right. That is, I think, the hardest thing to admit. We know his plan is better, and yet we just don't know what that is, because a lot of us, I think, are living lives that we wouldn't have picked. And yet, like, for, my own story, I would absolutely never have picked to get divorced. I would still be married to this day. Yet it's weird to say it's better. That sounds like so flippant, like, oh, it's better, he's gone. But it's the impact that I have been able to have, coaching and helping people. I would never have been able to relate at the level that I relate now. Now, would I rather
100%.
not have the pain? Well, yeah, of course, I'm a human being. But at the same time, it is better for me to be able to walk alongside people now and give them hope and help them process through their grief and what they're dealing with.
100%. And there's two things that come to mind as you say that. There's a Jewish view of God, or a name for God, or a tradition that says he's the God who wastes nothing.
Oh, I love that.
And that includes our pain. And, the God who wastes nothing. So what you just described is so beautiful, because the pain that you've had to endure, God has actually and is actually redeeming that pain for the benefit of countless others, right? And the beauty of a podcast format is you have no idea who will ever stumble upon this, and who will have, they'll hear something you say and it'll be meaningful to them, and it'll change their whole trajectory. Like, you will never know this side of eternity. And so the second thought is related to that. I imagine Paul writing letters to the churches in Ephesus, in Corinth, in Philippi. He was writing these letters from prison. If he had had his way, he would have visited them in person. In fact, he says that in the scriptures, like, I would like to visit you in person, but I'm stuck here, or whatever, right? Like, so in his plan, he would be going and visiting all these people and doing, quote unquote, God's work in person. But because he was shackled, he couldn't go in person. And so he wrote a letter to a church in a place called Ephesus. He wrote another letter to a church in Corinth. He wrote another letter to a church in Galatia. He wrote another letter to a church in Philippi, and so on. But because he was faithful to that, thousands of years later, here we are reading his words, and they're pointing us to Jesus. Like, right. I imagine that Paul, when he got to the other side and met Jesus, face to face in heaven, and God revealing, like, hey, Paul, check this out. I want to show you something. Remember that time you were in prison writing that letter? Look at what it did. Like, that is, if you sit with that for a second, that is mind-boggling. Yeah. And so for all of us, if we're attentive and honest with the pain, if we don't numb out on it, but if we're honest with it, and we take that pain before God and we surrender it and say, God, I trust. It's like that prayer, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Like, that's an honest human prayer. And I pray it a lot myself.
Yeah, me too.
I trust that this will serve your work. I don't know how. Right now it sucks. One of my friends taught me the phrase, he didn't teach it to me, but I can tend to get, kind of, Donald Duck, like he is super joyful and enthusiastic about life. And then something will set him off and he'll just go off. Right.
Yep.
That's me. Like I can, it might be traffic that day. It might be that the temperature is too hot. It might be whatever. My coffee's a day older than I wanted it to be. Who knows? And I'll just get like all fired up. And so my friend who's a spiritual advisor, just an amazing guy, spiritual formation pastor at Sandals Church. He's like, yeah, Nate, he has a way about him. Like when our kids were little, we would teach them, instead of complaining, we would just ask that they say, I don't prefer it. And so I'm just laughing because I'm like, he's teaching this, at the time I was, I don't know, mid 40s, late 40s, a lesson that he would teach his, 6-year-olds at the time. But I started practicing it. So when I'd get stuck in traffic, I'd be like, and, my tendency is to get all upset. I don't prefer the traffic today. I don't prefer the temperature today. I don't prefer the way that person just treated me. But what I've noticed it did is it took all the power out of the situation.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a way of practicing a certain surrender. Like, this is out of my control. I literally have zero control over the traffic or the temperature, right? And so I can practice a posture of surrender even with the very words that I utter. And so now it becomes like a joke with our family and friends, like, oh, he didn't prefer that. But it's actually been so helpful. And so, even that posture, I'm pretty certain Paul didn't prefer being in prison.
Right.
I'm pretty certain Paul was beating his chest going, God, if only I could be released from here, then I could do the things that you've put on my heart to do. Then my desires will be met. I want to plant churches. I want to minister. And yet he's stuck in prison.
Right.
And so we just never know. Like, our perspective is so limited. I was thinking about our family is going to go on a vacation here soon. And one of the things we want to do is snorkeling. And I was thinking about, like if we're looking at a coral reef with clean goggles versus looking at a coral reef with water in the goggles, like, I'm going to see a lot more with clear goggles than with water in them. Right. But I think our human state is such that we're looking at the world with water in our goggles, and we just have to trust what's actually there.
Love that. That is such a good way to think of it. Love it. Now, we've talked a lot about dreams that didn't come to pass or that came about in different ways. So I want to wrap up with a little bit of a positive question here. What is something in your life right now that's giving you joy or inspiration?
This is going to sound kind of funny. So I have come to just really appreciate time with people. So contextualize. I love spending time with my youngest son on the golf course because it's time together. I love when our whole family gets to travel together and they're all 5 of us are together and we're with one another. We try as often as we can to do family dinners around the table. My kids are, 20, 18 and 16 and they're just funny. Like, I love the unexpected humor that comes up as, 3 young men, and their parents are sitting around the table enjoying a meal, or, as an employer, as a boss, I love time with my staff. Like, I've got such an incredible team, and I just find myself with unexpected joys as I will laugh with them or joke with them or tell them I'm praying for them because they've got a big, I'm in coffee, so we get younger people working for us. And so, there's a transitory nature about the job. And so I get to celebrate when they're passing a major exam or they're getting that job interview for the job and career that they're really hoping for. Like, or if it's a customer walking in or, even doing things like this, like, I just love interacting with people. That brings me a lot of unexpected joys. And the reason I share that as if it's like some sort of epiphany is I can tend to be so driven, so goal-oriented that there were seasons in my life where I really struggled seeing the people in front of me. There were seasons as a boss where I would, kind of grumble a hello as I'd walk in. I'd walk directly into my office, shut the door, and not come out for a few hours. And a lot of that was due to stress I was carrying, but nevertheless. So allowing myself permission to be, and again, it goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of just being present in the moment, like giving myself permission to be present with the person in front of me, because every single one of us is created in God's image. And so we can enjoy each other and be present instead of trying to quote unquote have a conversation with somebody while I'm scrolling my phone or shooting off a quick email or responding to 6 text messages from this or that, right? Like, just being able to slow down and say, you know what? those tasks still need to get done. They'll get done. I need to create time for that. Like, I'm not talking about just, wandering the earth footloose and fancy free, but I am saying, within the context of our responsibilities, like allowing, I call it the holy disruption. So allowing space in our day for the conversation that you couldn't have planned, that wasn't on the script, it wasn't on the calendar, but somebody happened by, a coworker pops by your desk, or, an old friend calls you up, or whatever the holy disruption might be. Maybe it's a person you meet in the supermarket standing in line, but being attentive to that and seeing it as a gift, because there's a human being in front of you and you have something to offer them, and you have something to learn from them, and they have something to offer from you. There's this like beautiful, especially in a world that's getting more and more, I don't want to say fake, but artificial, more and more artificial. Mm-hmm. So my family and I joke, like, we're scrolling Instagram, we're like, is this real or is this AI?
Right.
Like, we're not quite sure anymore. So, and it's only going to get more. So like, what about that human to human contact? So that's a long rambling answer to say, I've landed in a place where I find so much joy interacting with real human beings and being open to the holy disruptions in my day, because you just never know when that disruption, and the reason I use the word disruption is like, hey, this isn't on my agenda today. Like, I got places to go. I'm in transit from point A to point B. And now this, pops in and kind of disrupts that. If you look at how Jesus was, he was never in a hurry. He was constantly embracing the holy disruptions. And it was those holy disruptions that made the stories. It was those holy disruptions that changed other people's lives. And if it's an interaction with a person that I've never met, and, just releasing it, I may never see them again. I might be one little notch in their long journey of hopefully finding God, and just, so there's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
Awesome. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for being here today. This has been such an encouraging conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your story and your wisdom with all of us.
Absolutely.
And for those listening, if you are in a season where life looks like nothing you had dreamed or hoped for, I hope you're leaving today with a little more hope and a few new tools for your journey. I want to highly, highly recommend that you check out Nathan's book, Clearing the Path, Connecting with God in a Cluttered World. It's available on Amazon. He has an ebook, print book, and an audiobook. And trust me, this is worth the read if you are feeling stuck or overwhelmed. So, Nathan, thank you again for being here today. I'm just so excited to hear listeners' response to this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.